Good morning, students. This lecture is for March the 25th. In our last meeting, we were discussing the industrial age, and we were talking about some of the new inventions and the impacts that they had upon people and society, and all the changes they were able to bring about. Well, not only did innovations bring about changes, but a whole new society will begin to develop as a result of the industrial age. It is going to unleash dramatic social change. There are going to be immense internal and external migrations as people move from the countryside to work in the new industrial cities. And industrialization will actually encourage the emergence of new social classes, especially a very rising and important middle class. And it will force men, women, and children to adjust to distinctly new patterns of family life and work life as well. Now, some of the benefits for a family, for example, would be that industrial production is going to bring about a reduce in the price of clothing. You've got it standardized, it's quicker, it's cheaper, and so that is going to help. It is going to turn out new tools at a fantastic rate. And these new tools are going to be able to help farmers with their work. You're going to have steam-powered locomotives delivering produce more quickly and cheaply. And as the rail lines expand to much, much broader markets. And so, as a result of this, the populations in both Europe and America are going to begin to rise. We're going to have better diets. We're going to have improved sanitation come along. And this is going to bring about a decline in both adult and infant mortality. The prospects for children are actually going to begin to improve. As child mortality had been very, very high throughout the pre-industrial age. Obviously, we're going to see migrants flocking from the countryside, and they're going to go to these new urban centers to find work. And cities are going to grow way faster than they could plan for. And as a result of this, it's going to create all kinds of new problems. Now, cities had always been unsanitary places. Think back to the little nursery rhyme, London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Why was London Bridge falling down? Because people had been piling garbage on it. And the garbage had begun to rot underneath, and the rotting of the garbage was beginning to rot the bridge. So people were not overly clean and sanitary coming out of the Middle Ages, to say the least. You had human waste running through the streets. And so there were problems with this. Well, with the increased magnitude of people, you have more of these problems. You have overcrowding taking place. You have more pollution. And quite honestly, you're going to have the rise of disease. You're going to have some diseases that are going to be job oriented. You're going to have other diseases that are going to be where you live oriented. And so a lot of people are going to be living in cities in very miserable conditions. Now, cities slowly will begin to respond, and they will begin to try to improve things. But while this is going on, the wealthy are going to flee the cities, and they are going to move into elegant homes in a growing area called the suburbs. And of course, they have travel that enables them to go back and forth to the cities to do their jobs. And so that is a great boom to them. Well, as this growing middle class begins to develop, they too are going to flee to the suburbs. And they're going to begin to develop their own type of society there in the suburbs. Now, I will say, in many respects, they are going to, in every way they possibly can, copy the wealthy class. Well, then that leaves us with the working poor, and that class will actually divide into two very sharply segregated groups. You'll have the working poor who are skillful. They may not be making as much as the wealthy. They may not be making as much as the middle class, but they have skills, and so they are doing better than the working poor who are unskilled. And so there's going to be, as this industrial age comes, a greater, in many respects, stratification of society than we have even seen in the past. Now, government authorities will try to address some of these situations. We will tend to have improved municipal water supplies. We'll expand sewage systems. They will introduce building codes. And of course, some buildings will be forced to be torn down so that people are not just living in falling down, crumbling hovels. City authorities will also build parks and recreational facilities to accommodate the growing populations. Now, there will also be not only migration from the country to the city, but there's going to be transcontinental migration. It is estimated that during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, about 50 million Europeans immigrate to the Western Hemisphere. And notice how I worded that. Not everyone is going to come to North America. We sometimes get the idea they do. But no, not everyone comes to North America. There are going to be some business opportunities and job opportunities for Europeans in South America, and many middle class, upper middle class, wealthy class Europeans are going to take advantage of some of these. Now, they don't necessarily bring about a whole lot of benefit for the people who have already lived there, but it will be quite a lucrative thing for the European business people. Well, if you're enterprising, and you're enterprising enough, you can become fabulously wealthy. People like the Rockefellers, the Gettys, and others are going to be people that are going to put together fortunes, live in fabulous homes, and so on. They're going to be able to have a home in the South, a home in the North, a home here, a home there. And we're talking about humongous palatial homes. There are places in Rhode Island where there are homes that the house itself sits on a 5-acre plot of ground, just the house, not counting the grounds that go with it. And these houses will be 2 and 3 stories. Marble fireplaces, tile floors, so many things going on. And so this wealthy class is going to increase, and it's going to flaunt its wealth for sure. And they will obviously overshadow all the traditional classes below them. Okay, the middle class. This is going to be small business owners, factory managers, engineers, professionals like teachers, physicians, attorneys. This is going to be a very growing class. Now, with the rise of factories and with the rise of some of these professional businesses, women are going to be able to sneak into the job market, and they're going to become secretaries, and we'll discuss some other jobs that are going to open up to women here in a few moments. But your laborers, they're going to be people that toil in factories, they toil in the mines, and of course, they're going to make some tremendous adjustments because they go from a calendar and clock of nature, we might say, to a time clock. And they're going to be expected to show up at a certain time, work steadily for ever how many hours, and we didn't have an 8-hour workday back then, and then they check out and go home. Well, all of this obviously is going to reshape family life then. Economic production is going to move outside the home, and there is going to come to grow a sharp distinction between family work, which would have been life on the farm, and now work in an industry and family life. So this is going to bring about some changes. The upper class and middle class men are going to enjoy a great deal of prestige because during that age it was thought that they should be the providers, they should be the breadwinners, and that especially married women did not want to work outside of the home. Upper class, that was just unthought of. In the middle class, they were trying as much as possible to emulate that upper class, and so it was important that as much as possible, middle class wives could be homemakers and caretakers for children, not someone who was working outside the home somewhere. And even our working class men enjoy some increased prestige because they tended to make wages far in excess of working class women. Now, we have a pay gap today that still exists. We haven't fixed that one yet. But in the late 19th, early 20th century, that gap was really big and really made a difference. So, what about young single women? Maybe they wanted to get out on their own, they wanted to get out of the home or whatever. What are they supposed to do? Well, there were mills and some factories where these young women could go and they could get jobs and they would stay in a boarding house. And these boarding houses would have very stringent rules to protect the young women and take care of them and try to keep them modest and protected in every way they possibly could. And so this was an opportunity for some young women to begin to get out and get on their own. But again, for middle class married women, more and more and more, the home becomes the sphere of where she is supposed to be. And of course, again, this is in part trying to copy that upper class and maybe look a little better than we are. Now, in the working area, a lot of working class women will work as domestic servants, in the growing middle class homes or in the upper class homes. And so the women question, as it is so called, was a term that began to be debated. And the debate was, what is the role of women in society? Of course, that debate's still going on today. We haven't answered all of those questions. But obviously, from the beginning of the 20th century and into the 21st century, women have made a lot of advances. That's not to say they have accomplished all of their goals, but they have made a lot of advances. Now, during this early industrial age, child labor is still a part of society. By the 1840s, the British will begin to pass the first of their laws regulating child labor. But you would have children as young as 6 and 7 years old, both boys and girls, by the way, working in coal mines. And of course, if you spend your entire life working in a coal mine, more than likely you're going to pick up something like black lung or some kind of breathing situation. And the end of your life may not be really that pleasant. Well, with all of this, we begin to have what is called a socialist challenge. The socialists deplored economic inequalities, and they condemned any system that exploited the laborers. You have people like Marx and Engels that will come along and think that all the problems of society are based upon that capitalistic competition that is going on. And they held that society was divided into two classes, the capitalist and the proletariat. And this appears on the eve of those 1848 revolutions that we talked about. But the failure of the 1848 revolutions actually hurt the socialist cause somewhat. Well, as time goes on, Marx and Engels will align themselves with communists who work toward the abolition of private property and what they called an equal society. Now, any nation that has ever gone communist, let me be very blunt with you here, any nation that has ever gone communist has not achieved this particular ideal. You still had the haves and you had the have-nots. What happened was those that were in charge could make the have-nots dependent upon them. But there was no such thing as across the board, everyone is equal and everyone gets the same benefits. So, what's going to happen? Well, political parties. By the way, the United States Constitution didn't even consider these. And yet, of course, as we have seen, they are going to become a major component of American life. But we're going to have trade unions. And the union movement, especially in the early United States industrial development, is going to be a very important aspect, because with unions you have a collective group being able to talk to the business owners and business leaders about needs and so on, instead of individuals going themselves. And so that is a louder, more effective voice. We will have newspapers. And more people are becoming literate, and so newspapers are something that are commonly read. Realize in the late 19th century, Everybody doesn't have a radio. We sure don't have internet, cell phones, and all of those things. You don't have nightly news, and so newspapers were quite important for the spread of information. And then you will even have educational associations, and all of these in some shape, form, or fashion will work at times to help advance the socialist cause. But nationalism, that we talked about in our former lecture, nationalism is going to be something that quite honestly helped overcome and counter the growing socialist threat. So you're going to have working people in an industrial society, and you're still going to have one major problem. Most of your governments, including that of the United States, are going to generally side with big business. That's where the money's coming in. That's where the government gets more money. And so when it comes to union business conflicts, you're going to find that a lot of times the unions are going to struggle heavily. And when times got bad, when there were recessions, when there were depressions, obviously those at the lower end of the working scale are going to be the ones that suffer the most with the loss of jobs. And of course, that's even true in our world today. So what the unions wanted to do was, number one, improve conditions for the workers' lives. They wanted to have higher wages for their members. They wanted certain protections. And this is going to be a protracted battle between the unions and the owners as they work through many of these situations. Well, as we enter this industrial age, we find out that global trade starts growing. You have industrial society fueling the demand for additional products. They need raw materials. And so many of these land-bound and territorial-bound, especially European states, are having difficulty scrambling for these things. And so they begin to reach out beyond them. Now, one advantage the United States is going to have is the fact that the United States had abundant natural resources. Of course, we have quite a bit of territory, more territory than most of your Western European states. And so the opportunity to have these natural resources was a very great boom to American industrialization. But let's understand that during the late 19th century, America is not the number one industrial power in the world. That's going to take a while. In fact, it will not be until 1890 that the United States can technically be said to have moved from an agricultural society into an industrial society. So all the early history of America is that of agriculture being the primary source of occupation for people. If you go back and you check some of the early census records, you'll find out as you go down the list what's the occupation of so-and-so and so-and-so, you're going to see farmer a whole lot because that's what most Americans did, especially in the South and in the West. Okay, well, this global trade is going to create competition. And we're going to have new means of transportation on the sea. We're going to come up with what are called clipper ships, which are much, much faster. We're going to put steam on ships, so if the wind stops, you can crank up the steam and keep going. And people are going to be reaching out to get agricultural and mineral products out of Africa, the Americas, Asia, Australia, and even Eastern Europe. And so there's going to be this intense competition for industrial resources, and this in part will contribute to something that we will talk about here in a little while, and that is the age of imperialism, where many of your European countries are going to begin to gobble up certain areas, especially of Africa, so they will have the upper hand in obtaining these various natural resources. So higher incomes are actually going to foster economic development in two ways. They're going to create flourishing, shall we say, consumer markets. And yes, one of those things that I know we all love tremendously, advertising, is going to become a part of world life. There are going to be people coming along and telling everyone, you just really can't live without our product. And of course, that has become a part of everyday life, even into our world today. So we have this flourishing consumer market. And as these new inventions come along, people are being told, you need this. You got to have this. Don't know how you've survived without this. And so there are going to be new selling techniques, and there are actually going to be new financing techniques. As we go in the late 19th, early 20th century, we're going to have where you can buy on time. You can make payments. Instead of having to save up and pay cash for something, you put a certain amount of money down and you make a monthly payment. And by the way, this will help ultimately lead in part to a global depression that will occur in the 1930s. So we have this on one hand. On the other hand, it encourages entrepreneurs to develop new products, and it encourages paying high wages to employees to have these products manufactured so you can sell them to the demanding consumer market. So it's a boom. And the late 19th, early 20th centuries are going to see tremendous changes. However, in most of Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, most of South Asia, and of course that would be India, and then Southeast Asia, there is little to no industrialization. Foreign investors will own and control the plantations and any kind of industry that might be able to develop in any of those areas. And so they are going to remain out of the field of competition, out of the field of large-scale global trade, and pretty much behind all the what we would call industrial nations. Now, industrialization will link all the peoples of the world in some interesting ways, but its greatest benefits and rewards are always going to go to those that control the tools, control the capital, and control the trade. So those at the top are going to do very, 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 very well. Those at the bottom, that is definitely not going to be true for them. Well, as the West, if we want to put it that way, begins to industrialize, and I might add that our new nation state of Germany is a huge industrial power, it became clear to the leaders of both Russia and Japan that they were going to have to do something. And so in the 1870s, we'll back up a little bit, you've got the Romanov czars ruling a huge tract of territory. Let's realize continental U.S. has 4 time zones. The continental Russia has 8. So basically double the land size that the United States has. And they try to have a central administration, but you still had a powerful class of nobles who owned most of the land and controlled most of the money. Peasants made up the vast majority of the population, but most of them were basically serfs who were bound to the land that they cultivated. And so they're way behind the rest of Europe in modernizing and changing circumstances and conditions. Russia will have a conflict in 1853 to 1856 with France and Britain in what is called the Crimean War. And during that war, it will be discovered that the Russian military was very much behind what had been taking place in Western Europe. And so the defeat is actually going to cause the czars, and by the way, if you don't remember, that word is basically a Russian word for Caesar. It's going to reevaluate and try to make some reforms along European lines. So in 1861, as our Civil War is raging, Alexander II will emancipate the serfs. And partially he does that to create a labor force for the emerging industries that are coming. And the government is actually going to encourage the development of industries to build up the Russian Empire. One of the most important things Russia will do is to really work on its rail system. And it will ultimately link the far-flung provinces of the Russian Empire as a result of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. This will be a most important thing. Then the Russians will have a great growth under the finance minister Witte. He will get the railroad done. He will push industrialization by reforming commercial law, protecting industries, supporting steamship companies, and promoting nautical and engineering schools. And so Russia's going to kind of come up and begin to try to catch up with the rest of Europe. And a lot of Germans are actually going to move into Russia to help out with this effort. Okay, so industrial growth does generate an urban working class, but it generally had miserable working conditions and even more miserable living conditions. And so all of this is going to be under the surface. And as we roll into the 20th century, all of this pressure and this discontent and this misery is going to be building up kind of like steam in a pot. And ultimately, that steam is going to have to discharge itself. And that discharge will come then in the Russian Revolution that will occur at the end of World War I. Okay, until 1853, Japan had largely closed itself off. And it did a pretty good job of doing so until Commodore Perry literally trained American naval guns on the city of Tokyo and demanded that Japan open itself up. And as foreigners begin to flood into Japan, it creates all kinds of crises among the Japanese people. You have the traditionalists that don't want to change. You have the ones who are very happy with the conditions in Japan the way they were. They don't like the modernization. But one thing we're going to find out about the Japanese, and this is a very, very important aspect of who and what they are, is the fact that the Japanese will be able to take all of this technology to which they're being introduced, and they will make it their own. You know, many people say, well, they copied everybody. No, they make it their own. And so they will learn, and they will learn from everyone they can, and then they will turn around and develop the techniques, the industry, whatever they need to be able to make it Japanese and do what is best for their particular country. Now, the Japanese emperor, during the Meiji Restoration, they will return to the authority there instead of a shogun, and he will become and compete with the world in the race for imperialism. And so in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Japan really begins to change. It really begins to evolve. They create a modern transportation, modern communication, modern educational system, and this infrastructure system that they develop will support rapid industrialization and economic growth. Now, the Japanese people will bear social and political cost. As I say, it's not going to be pleasing and happy for everyone. But Japan is changing. All right, let's go back to the Americas. As we look at the United States, of course, we fought our American Revolution against the British. And then, of course, we had to fight the British again in what is called the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 did not necessarily accomplish a whole lot except fostering a spirit of nationalism in the U.S. There will be a flood of American literature. There will be a flood of American educational works and development. And so Americans become proud of being Americans. But there is an underlying situation that has been changing in the United States, and this is going to cause all kinds of tensions. Now, I realize many times misinformed historians tell you that the cause of the American Civil War is slavery. No. There are multiple causes. The American Civil War was way, way, way more complicated than that. But, yes, slavery was an underlying cause. Now, before we get all upset and bent out of shape, let's realize that the vast majority of Southerners did not own slaves. This was something that the elite owned. And in the South, there were attempts to keep a nobility-style status alive. That's what plantation living was all about. Living in the big house, showing what we have that other people don't have, and so on. And so, as an underlying cause, and by the way, the Constitution says absolutely nothing about slavery. There's not a word in there about it. It was deliberately left out. And so, as we begin to develop into a nation, we start moving westward. We go from the East Coast coastline to the Appalachian Mountains. All right, Tennessee was a part of the West. Then we move from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. And, of course, after getting the city of New Orleans from Napoleon, we have a little stretch of land that extends up into what is now the American Northwest. And so Americans begin to develop an idea of what we will call manifest destiny. And by 1840s, when Americans spoke of manifest destiny, that meant that America, or the United States, was to occupy North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in its most extreme form, there will be many who will say that God himself ordained that should be true. So it almost becomes a religious thought that we are supposed to dominate from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Well, obviously, with this expansion, during the 1830s, east of the Mississippi River, there are going to be some final conflicts with the North American natives. And ultimately, under President Andrew Jackson, the remaining Native American tribes are going to be ordered to move west of the Mississippi River to what is going to be termed Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, and they're going to be resettled there. And, of course, what we call the Trail of Tears will take place, and it was a horrific thing. It was brutal. It was terrible. It was to impose as much hardship on the Native American people as could possibly take place. So by 1840, the conflict between Euro-American and indigenous people shifted to the plains west of the Mississippi River. Now, these Native Americans resented any kind of encroachment by white settlers and, quite honestly, at times won some very, very important victories over the white insurgents. In 1836, Texas will declare its independence from Mexico. There will be a brief civil war there. And ultimately, and quite honestly, because of the debate over free state, slave state, Mexico will be added to the United States in 1845. Well, Americans were looking at that swatch of territory from Texas all the way to California. And of course, that still belonged to Mexico. So the United States will kind of pull something that, like Bismarck did, we're going to concoct a war. And the U.S. is going to goad Mexico into the Mexican-American War. And quite honestly, at the end of the war, with Mexico's defeat, the United States will take possession approximately of 1/2 of Mexico's territory. By the way, it soured relationships tremendously with our Central and South American neighbors. But during the war, the United States made no major blunders for a trade. But one sort of sinister thing will happen. A lot of leaders that will be involved in the next war for the United States will be trained during the Mexican War. In fact, Robert E. Lee will be Ulysses S. Grant's commanding officer. You have many men that will become very, very, very close friends that served together in the Mexican War that will ultimately be divided by the American Civil War. Two that I think of that is such a tragic tale are Generals Hancock and Armistead. Hancock was from the North. Armistead was a Virginian. They went to West Point together. They served in the Mexican War together. They were stationed together. They were best men in each other's weddings. Their families associated with each other. They were intimate together. And then, bingo, here comes the war. And here are two very, very close friends that are divided over that war. And that's something I want you to see. Not only were close friends divided, families were divided. Mrs. Lincoln, yes, the president's wife, had brothers who were Confederate officers from Kentucky. So we're talking about a war that divides friends. We're talking about a war that divides families. It divides counties. Marion County, during the Civil War, had formed one company of Confederate soldiers, and Marion County formed one company of Union soldiers. So right here within our own county, there was division among the peoples as to which side they would support. Now, again, the majority of your Southerners were not fighting for the cause of slavery. Now, excuse the family reference. My great-grandfather, 5 of his brothers, several brother-in-laws, cousins, and people that they'd grown up with, all enlisted in what would become Company D of the 28th Alabama. Now, I have been able to trace my family all the way back to Wales. I have copies of wills. There are no slaves in my family. No slaves passed on from one generation to the other. In fact, my immigrant ancestor was actually an indentured servant, and he worked probably at a sugarcane plantation in Barbados because that's where he did his indenture. So this was not a slave-owning family. And yet, when Alabama went to war, they went to war with their state. Robert E. Lee will actually be offered command of the Army of the United States by President Lincoln. Now, Lee's house, if you have never been to Arlington, the front room window, big picture window, looks out across the Potomac River, and you can see the Capitol building. And Lee had one of the most difficult decisions that any American general ever had to make in history. Do I go with my nation, a nation to whom I gave my oath, or do I go with my state? And as Southerners did, Lee went with his state. Now, speaking of that 28th Alabama, to give you an idea, in 1862, the 28th Alabama mustered 2,200 men. In 1865, when they surrendered at Bentonville, North Carolina, there were 165 present. That's the toll the war took. Now, not everyone was killed. Some were wounded, went home. Others deserted. That happened, both armies. Some were captured. But of those 2,200 men, 165 were present for that surrender. And so you have a lot of issues. Increased presidential power, the division over slave states and free states, and the fact that up until a point, there had always been an equality, equal number of free states, equal number of slave states. And so in the Senate, at least Southern politicians had a balance. But when the far western states, California and Oregon, come in, of course, that creates an imbalance and a paranoia. And no, the South did not secede because Lincoln became president. Buchanan, the president before Lincoln, literally let the nation flow through his fingers like somebody trying to hold water in their hands. He did nothing in his one term to hold the United States together. So, if a president is to be blamed, it was Buchanan rather than Lincoln. So, as we go into the war, a major issue of contention is that of states' rights. The states in the South look at the Constitution as a contract. Okay? We contracted to join the Union. If we feel the Union is not living up to that contract, we have the right to withdraw from that contract. And so this was a major issue in the South. They felt the North was not living up to the contract. And so 11 Southern states will ultimately break from the Union. Initially, the issue for the North is you cannot legally break the United States apart. And so these were your two major points of contention as the war actually begins. But let me just quickly give you a list of causes. You have liberty versus slavery. Obviously, that goes all the way back to the Constitution. The sectional interests, the North becoming more industrial, the South remaining agricultural. So that causes conflicts. That contract theory of the Constitution. You have enhanced presidential power. And by the way, this is going to come with Andrew Jackson. A Southern president is going to exert himself more and more as a president, and that's actually going to scare the South. There's a Southern code of honor. There are just certain things you don't talk about. You don't talk about my wife. You don't talk about my horse. You don't talk about my dog. And Southerners still practice dueling as a part of this code of honor. You have popular sovereignty, where it was finally decided that new states, as they were added to the Union, we not just put a line across the continent and say everything below this will be slave states, everything above this will be free states, but they let the new territories, as they became states, decide what they were going to do. And then, of course, one of the things that will help ignite all of this is going to be John Brown trying to incite a slave rebellion. So all of this is going to bring about a war between the states. It will take between 650 and 700,000 American lives. It was desperately fought. You will have, at the end of the war, 1/5 of the southern male population dead, and most of the area in ruin. I mean, the South will literally fight until it's on its knees. It gave everything it had. Now, the one accomplishment of the Civil War is that the United States was to remain united politically. That's the result of the war. Now, I will say something about President Lincoln. His death was actually a tremendous loss to the South. Lincoln would have rebuilt the South. That's what he intended to do. He intended to get the southern states back in the Union just as quick as he possibly could, and would have gotten them back on their feet. He was a very strong president, and he probably would have been able to enforce his will with Congress. In his death, Andrew Johnson, who became president, by the way, he had been the military governor of Tennessee during the war, he was much weaker, and Congress was able to run over him. And so, after the war, something that is actually going to inflame and anger the South more than the Civil War itself was what was called a period of Reconstruction. That will last until 1877. And it left a long, bitter legacy in the taste of a lot of Southerners. Well, in the aftermath of the war, the North begins to rebuild and become more prosperous. The South is going to remain the least prosperous portion of the nation well into the 20th century. And the South is going to evolve into a farm system that in many ways was very, very hard upon poor whites and the former black slaves that were now freed. And this will be called sharecropping. You will have a landowner. He will dole out portions of his land to individuals. They will farm that land, and part of either the crop or the proceeds of the crops will go to the landowner. And it is a system that generally kept people in poverty. And so the South is going to have a slow emergence after the American Civil War. Cities are going to have to rebuild, and it is going to be a long process for them. Okay, let's go north. Let's go to our neighbors in Canada. Now, Canada was originally settled, if you recall, by British and French, but after the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, the French are expelled from Canada. That doesn't mean that every French citizen left, but it becomes British territory. In fact, in some areas, French Canadians actually outnumbered British Canadians. And in the province of Quebec today, French is still one of its official languages. In fact, if you look at Canadian money, it's bilingual. It has English and French. Okay, so there are attempts during the American Revolution to induce the Canadians to become a part of the American cause. They do not. They support the British. And a large number of British loyalists who flee the United States after the American Revolution will actually wind up settling in Canada. Okay, the War of 1812 actually again posed a threat to Canada. And the U.S. will make some attempts once again to invade Canada. And the American army will be defeated. And there will be quite a bit of anti-American feeling that will be promoted as a result of this. And so Canada will remain loyally within the British fold. In 1841, Upper and Lower Canada are united into a group of independent provinces. Now, real unity will come along in 1867 when Canada becomes the Dominion of Canada under its own prime minister. So, friendly with Britain, didn't war with Britain, just simply kind of became independent of Britain. And so each province in Canada has its own seat of government. It has a provincial legislature. It has a lieutenant governor that still represents the British Crown. And like the United States, Canada will very much develop in stages. There's always been a sense of struggle, of identity between Canada and its more powerful neighbor to the south. And they are way more politically and culturally diverse than we tend to be in the United States. Okay, let's go back to Latin America. Political unity did not outlast the wars of independence. So several Latin American lands are going to lurch from one constitution to another. They're going to have struggles creating political and social stability. Less than 5% of the average population is even going to be involved in the political system, and millions of the indigenous peoples are literally going to be left out of the whole picture. And so that didn't pose to bring about unity as we saw in the United States. Mexico will have its own series of troubles. They will have an individual named Benito Juarez who will lead Mexican society for a time. The war with the United States, of course, will be a huge setback. Santa Anna, that was ruling Mexico when Texas declared its independence, will finally be overthrown in 1855. Mexico will go through a revolution. France will come in for a time. And it will literally be the early part of the 20th century before Mexico begins to settle down and develop some forms of political stability. But again, Mexico has struggled from poor leadership and an inability to be able to pull its people together. As we say, the civil wars, you have the average people being beat up by one group and then beat up by another group. And so, for the most part, Mexican and Latin American peoples as a whole are going to lack education, profitable employment, and political representation. So it's going to be a very, very difficult time. Now, as I said earlier, you're going to have migration into both North and South America. Now, in North America, a lot of these new immigrants are going to provide wonderful laborers for the growing industrial system. And they ultimately will be brought in to American society. In Latin America, you will have a lot of European investment that will take place, but that investment will generally remain in the hands of the European individuals and the nation states that bring about that investment. Now, one thing that is going to help industrial growth in the United States, as it helped industrial growth through Europe and Russia and even Japan for that matter, will be the railroad system. This is going to be a tremendous boom. It is going to create jobs. It's going to create competition. It's going to allow Midwest farmers to begin to produce. And America is going to begin, in many respects, to be one of the nations that feeds the world. Chicago is going to become a major meat processing area. New York, San Francisco are going to be major shipping areas. And all of this is going to help the United States become a major trade partner in the world. So during the latter part of the 19th century, there is going to be a tremendous amount of industrial growth in the United States. Not so much in the South, but in the country in general. And so all of this is going to be a boom, and the United States is going to be seen and recognized, and it is going to be a nation that more and more becomes independent. Canada will be more and more independent. They'll have a good industrial base. They will do well. They'll be able to prosper. And then Latin America is going to remain dependent. It's going to be dependent upon the people who invest within them. So Canada will have prosperity, the United States will have prosperity, and Latin America is still going to be struggling and far, far behind its two northern neighbors. Okay, this is kind of a good stopping point. So we will end our lecture here, and we'll pick up at this point for our Monday lecture. You have a very good and safe weekend. And please be careful.